Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Over There, Why America Entered World War I, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Florida Virtual School Teaching American History Project and America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Tram, Vice President for Education Programs at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating our session this morning. We have a lot of territory to cover, so let me just whip through this introduction, which you're all familiar with anyway. Please go to the Over There website where you found the readings. There you will find the PowerPoint and recording of the presentation. You'll also find the evaluation, and as you know, that's important to us. We ask you to submit that and turn it in to us at the end of the seminar. As always, you'll receive documentation of participation, which you'll be able to present to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit the seminar warrants. Our goals this morning are really quite simple. We want to deepen our understanding of America's entry into World War I and to provide fresh resources and approaches to teach the topic. We have two simple framing questions. Why did the United States enter World War I? And what were the arguments for and against entering? We had a very robust discussion of this topic on the forum. You asked lots of really good questions. What threat, if any, did the stalemate in Europe pose to the United States? What role, if any, did William Jennings Bryan play in America's entrance into World War I? Which side, Allies or Central Powers, owed the most to the United States in goods and loans? Were American banks making conscious or unconscious decisions favoring one side or the other? Was the American press making an issue over British seizing of American goods on the high seas? What effect did World War I have on American agriculture? Did the demand for foodstuffs spur agricultural expansions, which led to the Dust Bowl? Socialists opposed the war, but with the increased demand for goods, what position did labor unions take? America appears to have been firmly behind President Wilson's desire to remain neutral. Did the press, captains of industry, and bankers conspire to bring America into the war? If a brokered peace had occurred with America as a mediator, what would have been the result of the debt owed to American banks, given that the burden for war reparations was placed on the loser? Did America delay its entry into the war, letting both sides exhaust themselves so that it would emerge as a superpower on the world stage? Why did the war become a battle of trenches? And finally, could the U.S. have avoided participation in the war? A lot of really good questions that illustrate a good deal of knowledge on your part about World War I. To help us work through some of those questions, and I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them, but to work through some, we are very pleased to have with us this morning Dirk Bonker, the Laverack Family Assistant Professor of History at Duke University. Dirk's research interests include militarism, empire, and warfare in the modern United States and Germany. This year, he has come out with Militarism in a Global Age, Naval Ambitions in Germany and the United States Before World War I. So let me turn the program over to Dirk. As I said, we've got a lot to cover. So Dirk, it is all yours.
Well, thank you, Richard, and hello, everyone. I'm excited to do the seminar. I hope it will give you a fresh idea for the classroom, and that it will be as productive for you as it has already been for me preparing it. Before we get started, I want to thank Richard for inviting me to give this seminar, and him and Karen Koplik for helping me to set up this presentation, for making things so easy for me. So thank you. I also like to now draw your attention to the various texts, the various primary sources that I've gathered, and that we won't have a chance to look at today in more detail. So I'd like to urge all of you to take a good look at them. They're all valuable for teaching. In fact, you might find some of them of greater teaching value than those that are part of this presentation. The topic today is the U.S. entry into the war in April 1917 and how it came about. Let me begin with some general remarks about the significance of the U.S. participation in that global conflict. The U.S. intervention decided the outcome of World War I. There can be no doubt that U.S. entry into the war prevented a German victory, but that in fact it assured Germany's defeat. In 1918, the Germans came close to winning a continental war in Europe. Yet they were defeated on the battlefield. The nearly 2 million soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force who were in France by the fall of 1918 make the key difference here. They did so at a time when the United States had already prevented the financial collapses of Britain and France, and was in fact bankrolling their war efforts. When the U.S. was providing these countries with essential raw materials and supplies, and when the U.S. Navy and Merchant Marine had assured the defeat to the German submarine campaign that for a while in 1917 threatened to paralyze the British war economy. The U.S. entry into the war also signaled a changing place of the United States in the world. In 1917-18, the United States engaged in a big power war in Europe, and at the end of it, American leaders started to create an entirely new world order. I mean, all of this represents a clear break to previous traditions of staying away from European great power policy, keeping distance to the foreign entanglements and warmongerings of the old world. The pursuit of war in 1718 then marked the emergence of the U.S. as a world power. It did so in a military sense, as the U.S. deployed massive military power across an ocean, and also in an economic sense, as the U.S. mobilizes its superior productive powers to great effect, and also became the leading creditor nation of the world. In fact, by 1918, the United States staked out its claims to become the world's first superpower of the 20th century. The war also had a profound impact on U.S. society and culture. The war led to a dramatic increase in the power of the state. Right? The federal government made itself felt in most aspects of American life. Perhaps most prominently, it drafted more than 4 million men into military service. The war revamped gender relations. It expanded, redirected employment of women in the labor force, helped to bring about the extension of voting rights, national voting rights to women. The war had a major impact on race relations. It promoted the Great Migration, the movement of African Americans to northern cities, and at wartime, and the wartime mobilization service of African Americans provided a large impetus for their freedom struggle. The war also marked a key moment in the history of American national identity. Another way, as the wartime emphasis on an integral nation led to a massive Americanization campaign that targeted so-called hyphenated Americans in a country in which about a third of the residents were first or second generation immigrants. The war had a huge impact on the economy and industrial relations, lifting the economy out of recession, leading to close cooperation between government and big business, and also lending new power and recognition to organized labor, and so on. So what can we then say about the American road to war? The U.S. declared war on April 6, 1917, after Wilson had asked Congress for a formal declaration of war on April 2nd, and 2 months after the United States had broken off diplomatic relations with Germany. But of course, the U.S. involvement in the war did not start in April 1917. In fact, it started in August 1914. So to understand the decisions for war made in 1917, we need to take a closer look at the entire period of American neutrality, beginning in 1914 and then punctuated by successive crises with Germany over submarine warfare. The entry into the war did not come out of the blue, yet it was by no means a foregone conclusion either. Until early 1917, neither the president nor the public wanted to get involved as a belligerent. President Wilson ran, after all, for re-election in 1916 on a platform of sort of keeping the U.S. out of war, and he won. So who made the key decisions? No doubt, President Wilson made the key decisions, supported by a few advisors. Yet, interesting enough, without involving key cabinet members, such as the Secretaries of War and the Secretaries of the Navy, or senior military leaders. Within his cabinet, Wilson had free rein after the resignation of Secretary of the State William Jennings Bryan in June 1915, and we will talk about the resignation in a minute. The decision for war was also a decision made by Congress. After all, it was Congress, in line with its constitutional prerogatives, that declared war in April 1917 after several days of debate. Of course, we need to also look beyond Congress and the political parties represented therein. The broader American public played a key role, was part of the decisions for war. American civil society was deeply involved in the debate. It helped to shape decisions made by policymakers in the administration and Congress. So in fact, the U.S. entry into the war in April 1917 was really the endpoint of a long public debate over how the U.S. should respond to the war in Europe. The key issues of this debate were neutrality, so-called preparedness, and intervention. This debate began in earnest in the winter of 1914-1915, when it became clear that the war would be a long one. The debate involved many groups, people, and institutions, from the president, his cabinet, and Congress, to press editors, interest and pressure groups of various sorts, political and social activists, to leaders of different ethnic communities, and finally to the proverbial men and women on the street. Across the board, American civil society became engaged, from vested interest in ardent patriots on the right to anarchists and radical socialists on the far left. And this brings me to a third point. America divided over the issue of war. Neutrality, preparedness, and intervention were all contentious issues. The divided nation went to war in 1917. When Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, he gave a lengthy speech, followed by 4 days of intense debate. At the end, 6 senators and 50 members of the House of Representatives still held out and voted against the declaration of war. Just compare this to what happened in 1941. The day after Pearl Harbor, FDR addressed Congress for, I think, about 6 or 7 minutes. And after a debate of about 40 minutes, there was a unanimous declaration of war. What can we then say, sort of, at the beginning about the American decisions for wars themselves? Wilson took the nation to war in 1917 over Germany's conduct of war. Right, this decision was prompted by the German decision for unrestricted submarine warfare and Germany's subsequent effort to get Mexico involved in a war with the U.S. the Germans knew would be coming. This is about the so-called Zimmermann telegram, intercepted by the British. In it, the Germans pledged their support to the Mexican government if it were to attack the U.S., and the Germans promised to return the lost territories of the U.S. Southwest to Mexico. But the American decision was not merely a response to German submarine warfare or to a violation of American rights as a neutral for that matter, let alone a response to a direct threat to U.S. national security. The U.S. ultimately intervened to shape the outcome of the war, to ensure Allied victory, and to create a new world order. The decision for war was or became part of the pursuit of what historian Michael Hunt has called a grand project of reordering the world according to American ideas. The Wilson administration entered the war to make the world safe for democracy. This decision in 1917 put an end to the previous policy of partial, one-sided neutrality. Early on, American neutrality had become a highly biased affair. In 1915, the Wilson administration had chosen to interpret American neutrality in a way that favored the Entente side. This was most evident in American reactions to the British and German conduct of maritime warfare, which each violated international law and American rights as a neutral nation. Yet America's partial neutrality also manifested itself in the way in which American policymakers handled matters of transatlantic trade and finance. So throughout the entire period of neutrality, President Wilson and almost all of the nation's political, business, and cultural elites were pro-British. It articulated a strong sense of Anglo-American affinity and community of interest. So in short, the Wilson administration did not want Germany to win and Britain to lose, and it tailored its policy of neutrality accordingly. And this bias also informed the various offers of mediation that Wilson made or authorized, including his peace initiative in the winter of 1670. Once the U.S. entered the war, the Wilson administration kept its eye on the pursuit of its larger project of creating a new world order. And in doing so, it maintained some distance to the Entente power, to Britain and France after April 1917. It joined the war effort only as an, quote, associated power, not as a formal ally. It maintained an independent field army under the command of an American general, and it openly promoted its own far-reaching goals, as summarized eventually most famously in Wilson's 14 points, this is 1918, that were not necessarily in line with the ambitions and stated goals of Britain and France. But short, the Wilson administration was not willing to sacrifice its own goals on the altar of the interests of other powers such as Britain. So much by the way of general introduction. So how are we going to proceed from here? Right? We begin by taking a closer look at the American neutrality policy and the challenges it faced. We will then sort of turn to larger debates overall on the issues of so-called preparedness before we take a closer look at the decisions for war in 1917, its makers, critics, and supporters. We will look mostly at sort of passages from various texts, but I also have collected some images that we will sort of take a closer look at as well. And we also, at the end, will see some cartoons from the African American press about the war and whether African Americans should join it. The Wilson administration responded to the outbreak of war with a declaration of neutrality on August 19, 1914. This declaration was in line with a long-standing U.S. tradition of neutrality, the broader sense of distance to European politics of war and empire that was central to American collective identity. What can we say about this declaration? We have a passage here in front of you, right? What were the challenges of neutrality for the U.S. as both a great power and immigrant nation? What is Wilson worried about? When Wilson declared that the U.S. quote must be neutral in fact as well as in name, and quote impartial in thought as well as in action, what does it mean? And Richard, perhaps would you mind reading the proclamation?
Sure. The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that there should be the utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the momentous struggle. It will be easy to excite passion and difficult to allay it. Those responsible for exciting it will assume heavy responsibility for no less a thing than that the people of the United States, whose love of their country and whose loyalty to its government should unite them as Americans all, bound in honor and affection to think first of her and her interests, may be divided in camps of hostile opinion, hot against each other, involved in the war itself, in impulse and opinion, if not in action. Such divisions among us would be fatal to our peace of mind and might seriously stand in the way of the proper performance of our duty as the one great nation at peace, the one people holding itself ready to play a part of impartial mediation and speak the counsels of peace and accommodation, not as a partisan, but as a friend.
Well, thank you, Richard. So what you see here in this text, right, is sort of a definition of on the one hand, of the United States as a neutral nation that should be a friend of all of the warring nations capable of mediating the conflict, etc. On the other hand, I think this is the most interesting part, is of course that the neutrality and the challenges of it are sort of set in the context of the U.S. being a multi-ethnic nation, being composed of people that may have sympathies for the different sides of the conflict. So here you can sort of see not only the assertion of neutral rights, but also that neutrality itself, of course, makes good sense for the U.S. because the U.S. was a multi-ethnic nation. After 1900, it had, in fact, just experienced another round of massive immigration from various European countries. In fact, like Wilson had to navigate a tension. It's been the pro-British bias of the elites versus a large sector of the population that had anti-British views. Right? Just think that about 15% of the population were Irish American and German Americans. They favored the Germans, or at least in the case of the Irish Americans, were very anti-British. There's also the American Jewish population, very anti-Russian and pro-German.
Dirk, we have a number of people in the chat who've noted the diverse makeup of the American population at that time, as of course now. We have a question. How much conflict was playing out between these groups? And maybe we could add to that question, was Wilson worried here about domestic violence, among the groups?
Two things here. Wilson was not concerned about domestic violence. This is more about sort of divided public. This is about, of course, also the way in which sort of different ethnic groups would play out in electoral politics. He was concerned about more sort of a divided nation, intense debate, and sort of the way it would sort of work it out politically. What we'll see later on in the presentation is actually how one of these groups, the German Americans, kind of dealt with this problem. So they were sort of suspected increasingly of not being loyal enough to the American nation. And what we sort of see eventually is a sort of Americanization campaign where they're really trying to target groups who need to be not American enough. But again, violence was here not on the table.
Okay. Well, how much conflict was there? Was this being fought? I mean, was it really a visible and much discussed tension among different?
I mean, the tension was very apparent, very visible in the newspapers, and the way in which the different communities had their own presses, and sort of articulated the different views of the war and their different preferences. So this is sort of about a very intense debate within the press, which then also, and this was the fear, was articulated within Congress and sort of turned them into sort of electoral politics. And we're actually, what we do see is if you look at Congress, is that if you look at voting patterns, the sort of different ethnic identities plays a huge role in understanding sort of how senators or members of the House of Representatives voted on a number of different issues. For example, a lot of the opposition to wall was centered in the Midwest, where you have very large communities of German Americans.
Right.
Right. So, if we sort of think about this proclamation of neutrality, I think the one thing here, of course, to keep in mind is that when it was declared, that at that point there was a sense that the war would be over soon, that the war would be short, right? Mm-hmm. As in fact, the European most of the European nations expected the war to be over mostly by Christmas 1914. This, of course, did not happen. The war sort of just continued to go on, and it sort of extended into 1914, then in 1915 became a long war. And this, of course, has raised more questions about American neutrality policy, and it really then tested this kind of commitment as the war kind of dragged on. So, what were the kind of issues that tested the commitments to neutrality? As we sort of look at sort of these issues, to sort of see that the way we can sort of understand the ways in which the Wilson administration responded to it, is that sort of revealing its preferences. In fact, the preference for the British came to shape Wilson's definition of American neutrality, its defense of American rights as a neutral nation. So let's first look at the issue of transatlantic trade and finance in wartime. Right, there were two issues here. One was sort of the trade of goods with the belligerents. And second, of course, the question of American loans to the warring parties. The document here on the screen is a letter from Robert Lansing, who succeeded Bryan as Secretary of State in June 1915. This letter here is most revealing about how financial and economic issues figured in American neutrality policy, and sort of what the impact of the war in Europe was having on the U.S. economy. For context, let me say this. When the war started, then Secretary of State Bryan convinced Wilson to ban American bankers from loaning money to belligerents. Already in November 1914, this policy was undercut as banks began borrowing from New York banks. In the summer of 1915, after Bryan's resignation, Wilson allowed foreign countries to sell bonds on the American financial market. This was a key decision. And if we Richard, would you mind reading parts of this letter? And I would suggest the first two paragraphs and then the final paragraph on the next slide.
Okay. Doubtless Secretary McAdoo has discussed with you the necessity of floating government loans for the belligerent nations, which are purchasing such great quantities of goods in this country, in order to avoid a serious financial situation, which will not only affect them, but this country as well. If the European countries cannot find means to pay for the excess of goods sold to them over those purchased from them, they will have to stop buying, and our present export trade will shrink proportionally. The result would be restriction of outputs, industrial depression, idle capital, and idle labor, numerous failures, financial demoralization, and general unrest and suffering among the laboring classes. Okay, shall we go on to the next slide there, Dirk? Did you want to do that?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. Manifestly, the government has committed itself to the policy of discouraging general loans to belligerent governments. The practical reasons for the policy at the time we adopted it were sound, but basing it on the ground that loans are inconsistent with the true spirit of neutrality is now a source of embarrassment. This latter ground is as strong today as it was a year ago, while the practical reason for discouraging loans have largely disappeared. We have more money than we can use. Popular sympathy has become crystallized in favor of one or another of the belligerents to such an extent that the purchase of bonds would in no way increase the bitterness of partisanship or cause a possibly serious situation. Now, on the other hand, we are face to face with what appears to be a critical economic situation, which can only be relieved, apparently, by the investment of American capital in foreign loans to be used in liquidating the enormous balance of trade in favor of the United States. Can we afford to let a declaration as to our conception of the true spirit of neutrality made in the first days of the war stand in the way of our national interests, which seem to be seriously threatened? So, yeah, as the war ground on, the policy of neutrality was indeed challenged.
Yeah, what we kind of see is kind of a certain dynamic, right? The Allies become dependent upon American capital and munitions and supplies, yet the American economy also became dependent on them in exchange. When you read this document, keep in mind that there had actually been a recession in 1913, 1914. The American economy was in fact started by war-related demand from abroad for American farm and factory products. The other thing to keep in mind here when you read the letter is that when the letter talks about trade, it really talks about trade with the British and the French, as the Germans were de facto excluded from trade with the United States due to the British blockade. And just take a look here at numbers. That I think illustrates the sort of unevenness of this. We can look at loans. Between 1915 and April 17, the Allies, Britain and France, raised $2.6 billion and another $2 billion by liquidating pre-war investments in American securities. The U.S. trade with allies went from about $800 million in 14 to more than $3 billion in 1916, and munition exports alone rising from $40 million in 14 to more than $1.3 billion in 1916. Contrast that to Germany. The Allied blockade made it impossible for American firms to export anything to Central Powers and for German firms to the U.S. So the U.S. trade with Central Powers, about $170 million in 14, was almost nothing in 1917. Same is true for bonds. Bonds attracted no significant interest on the American capital market, like $27 million in the period of neutrality. Let me now turn to the biggest challenge that American neutrality policy faces, and this is the conduct of maritime warfare by both Britain and France. In 1914-15, the Germans and the British engaged in naval warfare in clear violation of the framework of maritime law, and in clear violation of the rights of the United States as a neutral. The British blockade of Germany and the German conduct of submarine warfare diminished the U.S. ability to trade with all of the belligerents. It was here only German submarine warfare that the Wilson administration scandalized, and that led to successive diplomatic crises, eventually prompted the American decision to go to war in 1917. So what are we talking about here? Let me say a few things about these types of warfare before we take a closer look at the U.S. response. So here's the British blockade. It took shape between fall 14 and spring 15. And it carried a complete blockade of the North Sea so that the British would stop any ships from entering the North Sea and reaching Germany and the neutral nations. The British would route all traffic to Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands through Britain, subjecting them to control so that Germany could not receive trade or supply through neutral countries. So in short, the blockade ended any seaborne trade with Germany, thus radically diminishing the freedom of seas, the U.S. ability as a neutral to trade with Germany or for other smaller neutral countries. What about German submarine warfare? This is often an attempt to establish a blockade, here commercial blockade of the British Isles to submarines. The Germans declared waters around the British Isles as a war zone in which shipping was subjected to sinking by submarines. The submarine warfare took different forms. One, and this is the one that leads to war in 1917, was unrestricted submarine warfare. This was the warfare against any and all shipping, any neutral, military or civilian, armed or unarmed. So this is indiscriminate sinking without warning of ships. This war was unleashed on February 1, 1917. The U-boats campaigns in 1915, 1916 that created conflict with the U.S. and created the Lusitania incident, to which I will get in a minute, were more restricted. Here, they involved orders to submarine commanders to sink without warning any merchant ships under enemy flag, armed or not, but not unarmed passenger ships, again in the specially declared war zone around the British Isles. It also provided for action against neutral ships, but here following the pre-war rules and practices of commerce warfare that involved searches and seizures of ships and cargoes, but no sinking. So neutral shipping was exempted from the policy of sinking without warning. These campaigns in 1915 and 1916 created of course, a public uproar in the U.S. and led to successive crises. And even if they did not directly target neutral shipping. The 1915 campaign led to the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship on May 7, 1915. American passengers were on board. 128 Americans died that day, part of 1,200 people who died. Their deaths reminds us that the German blockade was different from the British blockade. That the German submarine campaign involved direct violence. It directly targeted the lives of civilian crews and passengers on ships. In that sense, it was very different from the British blockade. The British blockade did not endanger civilian crews and passengers in the same way. So this is important to keep in mind if we want to understand the kind of the American response to these two types of warfare. So how did the Americans respond? In different ways.
Dirk, if I could interrupt for a second, why did the Germans pursue that different policy? Weren't they aware that sinking of ships, that use of violence, would really alienate international opinion against them? Why didn't they do the same thing that the British were doing?
The Germans had to use submarines, and the problem with submarines is that when they were not submerged, they were incredibly vulnerable to attack. So the fear that the Germans had is if submarines were to stop ships and send in crews to sort of search a ship, but the submarines would then be very vulnerable to an attack and could be sank very easily. So in that sense, using submarines as opposed to sort of the kind of blockade that the British did with surface vessels really was the Germans forced them to sort of, or provided a reason to use military force in this more extensive way. The way in which the Germans tried to limit the public, the general damage, the political damage of the submarine campaign in 1915 and 1916 was to only target enemy shipping. This was a way of containing it. When the Germans in 1917 then also target neutral shipping, including West shipping. At that point, they're no longer concerned about the political fallout because they think at that point that they can win the war so quickly that the U.S. entry into the war did not matter at all. And I will get to that in a second when after we talk about the Lusitania incident in more detail. So,
right. So would it be safe to say that they were using submarines because they did not have the same kind of navy the British did? They didn't have the as many surface ships as the British did, so they were forced to use subs?
This is true. This is in part about sort of the force structure, the structure of the navy, but in part it's also about the geographic position. For the British, it was very easy to basically block off the North Sea at the narrow entrances and sort of guard this with surface ships, right? The British Navy is also the superior navy in terms of numbers. The Germans have a different geographic position. In order to really stop incoming trade to Britain, they needed to impose a blockade of, somewhere in the Atlantic. And for that, the only ships they had at their disposal were submarines, because their capital ship navy was kind of blockaded by the British as well. So the submarine warfare is in a way the weapon of the weak, whereas the British blockade is the weapon of the powerful and the geographically and the country in a superior geographic position.
I see. Thank you. I often wondered about that. Well, shall we move on then?
Okay. So we have different responses, right? The American Bush administration does not mount a sort of a main diplomatic challenge to the British blockade. It basically tolerates it in spite of some protest, and that kind of means, in other words, the Americans were okay that the British blockade basically diminished the American right to trade with Germany. and that it restricted even trade with neutral countries in Europe. On the other hand, the Wilson administration scandalized German submarine warfare, eventually threatened sanctions and a breakup of diplomatic relations, which of course included a threat of war, forcing the Germans in 1915 and 1916 to back down and restrict their campaigns. And President Wilson used this sort of submarine campaign then to scandalize the German conduct of war in general as a brutal, uncivilized type of warfare, engaged in by an autocratic, uncivilized state. What was at the center of the scandalization in 1916 was the safety of American citizens on board of Allied ships, mainly British, as passengers and crews. And this was the story of the Lusitania. And here, I mean, we have the image here from the New York Times, right? In some ways, this is a foundational event, with sort of the American response to German submarine warfare. This was a contentious issue in 1915, in the sense that at least part of the administration thought that the U.S. should not just scandalize the German conduct, but also the British conduct of blockade. So here, if we take a closer look, we sort of see how the Wilson administration handled the challenges of maritime war. And let me get to the next slide. Here, we have responses, and maybe Richard, you can read to us the Wilson second Lusitania note, June 9, 1915.
Okay. The fact that more than 100 American citizens were among those who perished made it the duty of the government of the United States to speak of these things and once more to call the attention of the Imperial German government to the grave responsibility which the government of the United States conceives that it has incurred in this tragic occurrence, and to the indisputable principle upon which that responsibility rests. The government of the United States is contending of nothing less high and sacred than the right of humanity, which every government honors itself in respecting, and which no government is justified in resigning on behalf of those under its care and authority.
So here you see a very strong language, and in the other note, you sort of see that Wilson is more explicitly threatening the Germans and asking for strict accountability and for an end to this type of warfare. Also note the end of the passage here, which is sort of the language of the rights of humanity in the way in which it is the U.S. Pursuing them. And this, I think, you should keep in mind when sort of reading later on Wilson's Declaration of War in 1917. We now look at the text to the left. This is actually by Secretary of the State Ryan, who actually resigned over the Wilson's handling of the Lusitania incident. What we see here is that he's critical of sort of the Wilson's handling, not so much because he sort of in any way sort of sympathizes or defends the German conduct, but what he's also doing, he's kind of pointing out the British conduct of blockade. And the crucial passage here is, and I may read it myself here, is this sort of in the middle, because we unsparingly denounce the retaliatory methods employed by her, meaning Germany, without condemning the announced purpose of the Allies to starve the non-combatants of Germany, and without complaining of the conduct of Great Britain in relying on passengers to give immunity to vessels carrying munitions of war, etc. So what we have here is a demand that the Wilson administration should also protest against the British. What you also see here when he sort of talks about the starving to non-combatants of Germany, this is of course right identifying a main feature of both the British blockade and the German blockade. What the main features, of course, these are blockades that directly target civilian populations. So the purpose of these blockades is starving enemy populations to death. So these are both very brutal ways of war that sort of pursue victory through the mass deaths and mass starvation of civilians. We now go to the next slide. We'll sort of see another response to the Lusitania address, this time from former President Theodore Roosevelt. What you here see is a very sort of a much bigger and more expensive outrage over the sinking of the Lusitania by TR, and he frames this as a moral issue. And in fact, What TR wanted in 1915, unlike Wilson, is he actually demanded that the U.S. would go and take more drastic action against Germany, not just complaining and threatening sanctions, but indeed sort of going, perhaps with threatening Germany right away with war. So in that sense, if you sort of put these passages from Bryan, from Wilson, and TR next to one another, you sort of see in some ways Wilson taking a middle position. He wants the Germans to stop this kind of war. He threatens with sanctions, but he doesn't go as far as TR, who frames this in more issue. It really wants the U.S. to drop neutrality at this point. Bryan, on the other hand, thinks that Wilson's going too far. It's too one-sided. That he also needed to scandalize the British. We know how this ended. Bryan resigned. Wilson got his way. And in fact, Wilson communicated to the Germans very clearly that their submarine warfare, if continued and even if extended, could very well push the U.S. into the war. And it did so at a time when the press response to the Lusitania incident, and you saw the New York Times thing, had actually not been belligerent. Of 1,000 newspaper editors responding to one poll, only 6 called for war. The German policymakers in turn took these warnings serious. As I mentioned before, they put their campaign in hold in 1915, and again, when they started another campaign in 1916, which again led to another incident, they again sort of responded to American demands. This changed in the winter of 1617, when the Germans decided to now wage a really extensive campaign against not just British shipping, but also against neutral shipping. And they knew at this point that this would lead to war with the United States. This is why they sent the Zimmermann telegram. And they, of course, the Germans thought so because it just wouldn't matter. They could win the war within 6 to 8 months, while before the U.S. could fully mobilize. The naval leaders also said that the submarines would prevent the U.S. from sending troops across the Atlantic. In any case, which, we're quite wrong on that point. But before we go ahead now, let's just another look from a different point of view at the submarine crisis in 1560. The stake here in some ways, right, and this, at least in my classes, works really well sort of for discussion with students. What was at stake here was the private right to travel, right? The major submarine crisis in 15 over the Lusitania was the death or injury to U.S. citizens traveling on their own free will on Allied passenger ships into a war zone. Let's take a look at the advertisement here in the New York Times, right? And the German response to it, the notice to the left in the same newspaper, right? There's a sort of counter-advertisement warning potential passengers of the grave risk involved in travel to a war zone. Right? What is striking here? The Lusitania advertisement cast travel as a purely private transaction between passengers and the shipping company, as if Europe was not at war. And in line here was the by now well-established practice of transatlantic travel by the American elites. By contrast, the Germans draw attention to the fact of war, the risk that involved in travel into a war zone, the risk of which the passengers were fully aware. So that sense, the right to travel here is sort of a part and sort of asserted in sort of a non-political way. It's just basically part of private lives of American citizens. This sort of in the wake of the Lusitania incident, then there emerged a debate about this issue, whether Americans should be allowed to travel into a war zone and whether the government should stop them or protect their rights, and if so, at which cost. In fact, we see an attempt, this is the Gore-McLemore Resolution 1916, an attempt on the part of some congressmen to restrict the right to travel. Here, at least on armed vessels of belligerent powers, and at this point, armed vessels of belligerent powers also included British merchant vessels, commonly believed to carry weapons. So this was a congressional resolution to kind of restrict this right, because this right would sort of produce conflict, could potentially draw the U.S. into the war. Wilson opposed this resolution vigorously and successfully. He refused to consider any limitations. In one of the documents that is also on the website that we can't talk about today, this is an exchange of letter with a senator. He sort of very clearly sort of states his commitment in protecting the rights of Americans as private citizens to travel into the war zone.
Dirk, we have some questions in the chat. One here about the Lusitania. Was the Lusitania shipping ammunition?
Yeah, the Lusitania was a passenger ship that was also shipping ammunition. So what we actually have here on the British side is that they deliberately, I mean, they kind of put ammunition on board, thus making this Lusitania, marking it as a ship that the Germans would sink. And we can, of course, ask the question, why were they doing this? Were they doing this because they thought the Germans would let this passenger ship through? Thus, this was a way of just getting certain supplies to Britain without any risk, or were the British in some way thinking that the Germans were aware of this risk and thus perhaps tempted to sink the ship, thus producing an incident that could draw the U.S. into the war, and thus, of course, on the British side.
Right. And we have another question, too. Why would anybody necessarily travel on a British ship? I mean, if they traveled on an American ship, that would have been safe, right? I mean, they were not, America wasn't at war at this point. So
I think,
in the first part of it, yes, go on.
I think that's a great question. That would be my question, too, right? Because in a way, because of this German notice, right, it was sort of the Germans warned, right? And there's this question of, why do civilians travel into war zones, right? If we think about present day, the present day world, it's like, why would you want to travel to certain places in the Middle East, right? And what should the government do to prevent this from happening? But that is, of course, a question, right? Of course, it gets, I mean, it's very tricky to talk about it, right? Because on the one hand, we are talking about victims of a ruthless military action, right? At the same time, there's this question of why were they putting themselves possibly into harm's way? That is a good question that I could ask those passengers that question. I would be very interested in their answers. So in a way, like economic issues, like to move on, right? So
well, if I could, I'm glad you mentioned economic issues because there's another line of discussion here in the chat. Traveling to Europe by ship, was that pretty much the province of the rich and privileged at that time, or was that something that people did up and down the economic order? I asked that question because you said earlier the kind of elites of American society favored the British and the rest of the folks had their loyalties divided. So just briefly, what was ocean liner travel like then? Was that something just the wealthy did, or was that the mode of transportation if you were going across the Atlantic for everybody?
Yeah, this travel became very common and very sort of widespread among the elite population and sort of like upper middle class people. This was a travel to Europe. It's very different the other way. But this is something that, like on average, was kind of an elite and sort of upper middle class thing because it was very costly. And the Lusitania was kind of very I mean, the tickets were very expensive. It was kind of a luxurious travel. So this is, we're not talking here about sort of common folks just traveling to the war zone. I mean, so I hope this answers the question.
Okay, I think so. That was good.
Okay, so far we've talked about economic issues in maritime war, right? They were central to the larger debate in the U.S. over war and neutrality. But so was another issue, the issue of so-called preparedness. An integral part of this debate. It's around in American neutrality. It also, in some ways, helped to pave the road to eventual U.S. intervention. So what can we say about this so-called preparedness campaign? It was launched by a broad-based movement of elite figures, the Army leadership, and middle-class reformers. This movement was spearheaded by a new association, the National Security League, which was centered in the major northeastern cities and funded by banking and commercial interests. Preparedness was a proposition in demand for a rapid military buildup in the face of the ongoing war in Europe. The U.S. advocates of preparedness argued needed to create a military on par with those of the warring nations of Europe. When making their case, proponents of preparedness talked about readying the U.S. for possible confrontation with big powers after the end of war in Europe. So this is very important. Preparedness was not about making a case for armed intervention in the ongoing conflict. It was really about a post-war future in which the U.S. would sort of face the winners of the war in Europe. And for that, it needed to be prepared. The center here was the demand for a mass army based on military conscription. They cite that the creation of a navy second to none. The introduction of conscription was really sort of the central theme of the preparedness campaign. It was seen as a prerequisite to create a mass army in wartime. So committed and concerned with preparedness advocates that they created special training camps. The famous one is in Plattsburgh, where about 20,000 potential army officers trained in 1915 and 1916. I mentioned Plattsburgh because one of the visual images that we will look at is about Plattsburgh. The Wilson administration embraced preparedness by 1915, 1916, and then pushed for a bigger army and navy, and this leads to the National Defense Act in 1916 and a major naval act as well. The preparedness campaign encountered fierce opposition. As I said, the U.S. was divided over issues of preparedness and neutrality. One of the more prominent critics were the American Union Against Militarism and the Women's People's Party, both founded in 1915. And these organizations mobilized religious pacifists, liberals, also socialists, and groups from the social justice wing to the progressive reformist movement. We have here two excerpts about preparedness. One is from a famous speech of TR, and the second one is a memorial. This is the next slide of the American Union Against Militarism. And I think these excerpts give you a sense of the kind of arguments that were and that both sides made, and the kind of the terms of the debate about reading. And in some of the other readings that are also on the website, there are longer texts that sort of have more fully developed arguments. But I think these two passages that give you a good sense. Perhaps, Richard, you could read to us the TR text.
Such service would be an immense benefit to the man industrially. It would not only help the nation, but it would help each individual who undergoes the training. Switzerland has universal military service, and it is the most democratic and least militaristic of countries, and a much more orderly and less homicidal country than our own. Camps like this are schools of civic virtue, as well as of military efficiency. They should be universal and obligatory for all our young men. Every man worth his salt will wish to come to them. As for the professional pacifists and poltroons and college sissies who organize peace at any price societies, and the mere money getters and the mere money spenders, they should be made to understand that they have got to render whatever service the country demands. They must be made to submit to training in doing their duty. Then, if in the event of war they prove unfit to fight, at any rate they can be made to dig trenches and kitchen sinks, or do whatever else a debauch of intelligence in professional pacifism has left them fit to do. Both the professional pacifist and the professional hyphenated American need to be taught that it is not for them to decide the conditions under which they will fight. They will fight whoever the nation decides to fight and whenever the nation deems a war necessary. I wonder what he really thinks.
So, I mean, what can I say about this text? I mean, it really speaks for itself, right? It's, it's highly gendered, denounces pacifists. It also denounces these hyphenated Americans. I think what is important about this passage analytically, and I think where one can use it to great use, is to show that preparedness was never just about enhancing American military power. It was also about remaking the American nation, making new men, making virtuous citizens. Turning sissies into patriots, turning like effete men into marshalmen, turning hyphenated Americans into true patriots. So what is important here is that they call for, or that the champions of preparedness used conscription, universal military training as a way to rejuvenate the nation, to inculcate quote martial and civic values into American men, to restore their proper manhood, allegedly in crisis, create an integral nation. So preparedness was not just about strictly military matters. We now turn to the next slide. We see this is a memorial of a memorial by the American Union Against Militarism. We have a different view here, and we don't have time to read this out, but just sort of let me just mention this a few times here. Right here, preparedness is equated with militarism, and because it's equated with militarism, it's associated with Europe. So here we have a contrast between a peace-loving America and sort of European militarism, and sort of the case for turning the U.S. into a warmongering militarist nation through preparedness. So there are fears here of the arrival of militarism in the U.S. and sort of a Prussianizing, of Europeanizing the United States through the sort of societal militarization in the name of preparedness. So this is kind of like one critique of preparedness and militarism. But of course, there are also more radical voices. I mean, the American Union Against Militarism and also the Women's People's Party were not particularly radical. They were still sort of anchored in kind of a pacifist, liberal, and democratic view. There were more radical voices. The most important here were prominent anarchist Emma Goldman and socialist leader Eugene Debs. Their views also represent an important part of the U.S. debate over war neutrality intervention. After all, Debs had won 6% of the vote in the presidential election of 1912 as a candidate of the American Socialist Party. Debs was also one of the key organizers of the Industrial Workers of the World, the radical wing of the American labor movement, which championed workplace democracy and denounced capitalism. But what were their views? In front of you is a text here from 1917. We could have easily taken something from 1915 or 16, such as Emma Goldman's article on preparedness, the road to universal slaughter, which is also among the readings on the web page. What we have here is a text by Debs defending a report of the Emergency National Convention of the Socialist Party convened on April 7, 1917, one day after the U.S. declaration of war in St. Louis. Right? And if we kind of read this, right, we have a much more fundamental critique of war and preparedness. Right? This is sort of organized around a sense, the language of class. Right here, the war is critiqued as a class war, and we have here kind of a contrast drawn between national war and sort of international revolutionary socialism. Right? The socialists have, from the text there, neither pro-German nor pro-Ally. They're international socialists. They're against any kind of capitalist wars. A class war, the only thing interested is basically the class war, but here defined as a war to kind of overthrow capitalism, and that is a cause that unites workers across all nations. So workers should turn against the capitalist class in their own countries instead of participating in a war led by these classes against one another. In 1917-18, Debs sort of stuck to their convictions, giving anti-war speeches and advocating draft resistance, for which they were imprisoned. The Socialist Party became a target of federal authorities and citizens. So their opposition was much vilified. It also stood in striking contrast to the position taken by mainstream union leaders and organizations. Here, of course, talking about the AFL with its president, Bonker. They supported the U.S. entry into the war. And bumpers used the war to enhance organized labor's power and prestige, and also to sort of increase wages for workers. So bumpers and the ALF helped the state and big business to coordinate the war economy, and they were also eventually complicit in the suppression of the more radical elements, such as the Socialist Party and the IWW. Okay, so this is sort of the more radical sort of socialist and anarchist opposition to talk about preparedness and possible intervention. Critique of the policy of the Wilson administration also came from a different corner, here especially from the community of German Americans, a community probably 9 million people strong in 1914. Its leaders continually made the case for U.S. abstention from war, and they always critiqued Wilson's policy of neutrality, responses to Maritime warfare, his handling of issues of trade as too one-sided, as pro-British. As the U.S. moved towards war, this community of German Americans then came increasingly under attack. Its loyalty to the American nation was questioned, most viciously perhaps by TR. Remember this little passage where he rails against hyphenated Americans. There's more of that in his other speeches, specifically targeting German Americans, who then after 1917 became target of the Americanization campaign. On the slide in front of you, you find a passage from an editorial written in 1915 on the occasion of the Lusitania crisis by one George Sylvester Viereck, a prominent German-American writer and editor. This sort of passage gives you a sense of the kind of sentiments and arguments that came from the corner of German Americans. And what they have here in the text is a critique of the British and their quote lawlessness. It's interest sort of in a reason that it's possible to reason with the Germans, that the Germans in fact are a reasonable country. We see also here professions of quote unflinching loyalty to the U.S. and the warning that a war with Germany would create a rift in the heart of our citizenship, right? And this sort of goes back to Wilson's proclamation of neutrality. Dirk himself eventually offered his support for the war, after he had sort of argued against it at the very last possible moment. In April 1917, he eventually cast himself as an American patriot willing to fight against Germany, yet he also insisted that the U.S. should keep a clear distance to Britain as it was entering the war. Some of the editorials that I also provided you with are from 1917 are very striking. And interestingly enough, he had changed the name of his magazine from Fatherland to the New World. This is sort of as a part of sort of like performing his full loyalty to the American nation, creating a distance, some kind of distance at least, to Germany. The debate over neutrality, war, and preparedness was also shaped by propagandistic mobilizations, especially mobilizations using visual images. In fact, images framed the case for preparedness, military neutrality, and eventually American belligerence in very powerful ways. Right? Images are so powerful because they invest the imagination of viewers in ways that text simply do not do. Right? Just look at these images. Right? Think about, what are some of the most powerful aspects? What kind of arguments are they making? How do they frame their thesis? There are three images here, right? I mean, let's begin maybe with the one on the left. Destroy this mad group, enlist U.S. Army. This is from 1916. What we have here, I mean, it's very obvious, right? This is about the construction of the Germans, right? The racialization of the German, representation of the brute. This sort of the threat and the transgressiveness of this sort of like racialized image of the person is also heavily gendered, right? The brute has the female figure, intimation of sexual violence. The woman is presumably the one of the Statue of Liberty, which also means that the German brute is a threat to both liberty itself and to America. And he's sort of seen sort of coming and crossing border, i.e. to presumably invade the United States. Let's take a look at the image in the middle, enlist. This is from 1915 in direct response to the Lusitania attack. It really speaks for itself, right? A mother and her baby drowning. Innocent victims of the German submarine attack, which is thus marked as uncivilized, right? As it kills a mother and her baby, right? And this, of course, at the same time is an appeal to men to join the military and come to the rescue of this woman, of prevent this from happening again. In a way, this brings us to the third image, which is from 1915. Are you trained to defend your country? Right. This is about the case, the preparedness case, the case for universal military training. You see here kind of a citizen soldier in uniform, representatives of the nation, right? The white men, right? Contrast this to the brute to the very left, right? Coming to the rescue of the women in the middle, right? What we see is also the promise of remaking the nation, right? This is sort of a new American man, militant American manhood. Right, and these kind of images, right? We can sort of understand then why it is possible to go to the war against Germans, right? If they're brutes and racialized in this kind of way, and you sort of see here the promises of going to war, it is also about remaking the nation, and it's at the same time framed in the gender term as a war in defense of civilization. So these kind of images frame the case for American belligerency. Let's now turn to the decision for war in 1917 and take a closer look at Wilson's case for war. Wilson took the nation to war in spring of 17 after he had just won re-election as a man of peace and domestic reformer. The decision, I mentioned this, was prompted by unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson's first answer had been a policy of armed neutrality short of war, with U.S. warships protecting transatlantic travel through ships and American people, but this was a transitional measure that eventually gave way to full belligerence. As I said at the outset, Wilson did not go to war simply to stop the submarine threat and to defeat the Germans. Rather, he pursued a grand project of reordering the world according to American ideas, making the world safe for democracy. And in fact, here you have the passage that uses the term safe for democracy. Wilson had already outlined his case in a speech to Congress, and he outlined his case in a speech to Congress on April the 2nd, right? This is the exit. And he had laid out his ideas also in previous speeches, most notably in an address to the Senate from 22nd of January. And this is also part of the collection of sources that provided to this. In the speech in January, Wilson outlined his ideas about a, quote, peace among equals and a peace, quote, without victory. He called for a League of Nations and an end to secret power politics. Then he issued a call for democratic nations, for making all nations into democratic nations. So here we have the text from April the 2nd. And perhaps we can sort of briefly go over, and Richard, you want to read at least part of it?
Sure.
Maybe starting in the middle where it says, well, why don't you go ahead and read the entire passage?
Okay. It's not that long. We are accepting this challenge of hostile purpose because we know that in such a government, following such methods, we can never have a friend, and that in the presence of its organized power, always lying in wait to accomplish we know not what purpose, there can be no assured security for the democratic governments of the world. We are now about to accept gauge of battle with this natural foe to liberty, and shall, if necessary, spend the whole force of the nation to check and nullify its pretensions and its power. We are glad, now that we see the facts with no veil of false pretense about them, to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the right of nations great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundation of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and freedom of nations can make them.
Well, thank you. So there are many striking things here, right? I mean, one of them, I think, is this providential language, right? The U.S. has a special mission. The world's most advanced enlightened nation, and it has, it's a world, and that it can try to make the world safe for democracy. Right? These general inspirations then in turn are linked into the keys for democracy that seemingly applies across the world. Of course, in fact, we kind of know, this is just an aside, that the case for democracy in Wilson's view only applied to Europe, not to the outside world, that is to say, to other countries. The subtitle of this is the denunciation of Imperial Germany as an autocratic monarchy set against the civilized world, right? Then again, the implication of autocratic German militarism committed to force beyond the demands of humanity lent shape to Wilson's rhetoric as well. So what then? Again, here again, this is a question, the language surrounding sort of Wilson's grand project. What about congressional opposition? How did it respond to Wilson's argument, especially to his sort of language about making the world safe for democracy? So two speeches, the speeches by two Republican senators, Robert La Follette and George Norris, and by House Majority Leader Claude Tipton as Southern Democrats, give you a good sense of this. And I mean, what we have in front of us is just an excerpt from La Follette's speech, but the other speeches are also available online. So what were these speakers arguing? None of them thought that German suffering was a reason to go to war. They all thought that the U.S. should retain resistance to the war. Necessarily just needed to restrict its own trade, transatlantic trade and transatlantic travel. All of these speakers were critical of the biases of the previous neutrality policy. They also, again, suggested the U.S. should just simply let the German campaign run its course. They also countered Wilson's rhetoric of this sort of armed universalism with the language of peace as a universal value as such. Again, they suggested there was no threat to the national security or territorial integrity of the U.S. Addressing the motives of those championing war, George Norris suggested that, quote, we are going into war upon the command of gold, end of quote. They also claimed that the U.S. was putting the dollar sign on the American flag. This is again in the excerpts that in the speeches that you have available on the website. But in point of view is Senator La Follette's direct response to Wilson's framing of the war as a war for democracy. So this is slide 29 and slide 30. I'm not sure we have time to sort of read it out loud, but what's striking here is that Napoleon really takes on directly sort of Wilsonian rhetoric about sort of democracy, the spread of democracy, and the way in which the U.S. is sort of destined to spread democracy, to fight for democracy as a universal cause. He takes it on a number of levels, right? I mean, he points out that the American allies are not so democratic themselves, and in fact, that Germany, in many ways, is at the end here, is actually a very advanced country. He refers here to the social industrial reforms at the end of this paragraph. He also then, and again, with the American allies are not so democratic, he sort of talks about, you know, the British being like a monarchy, having the House of Lords, a hereditary landed system, limited suffrage, and so forth. Second, he makes a point that, of course, asking Germans to overthrow their own government is sort of undemocratic itself. It is sort of being imposed upon the Germans from above. Third, he makes sort of a case for direct democracy. This is sort of at the end where he sort of says that that Wilson should submit the war to a vote of the people before a declaration of war goes into effect. After all, Wilson had run on the peace platform in 1916. And the last of these, and this is on the previous slide, La Follette makes a very interesting point, because in the middle of the text, he says, the President has not suggested that we make our support of Great Britain conditional to her granting home rule to Ireland or Egypt or India. So he really identifies the key problem of the Wilsonian rhetoric, which is that this language of democracy was supposed to apply only to Europe, not to the other parts of the world, especially those where you have a British or French empires. In fact, one of the things that happens at the end of that happens in 1918, that many sort of nationalist leaders in places like Vietnam, Egypt, China, and Korea, they saw that they could use Wilsonian rhetoric to make a case against European empire. And they looked to Wilson for guidance. But Wilson was not ready to make that case. He kind of accepted the existence of European empire, and he sort of limited his case for democracy to Europe. So in that sense, his universalism was anything other than universal. So maybe so much about Wilson's congressional critics. I want to conclude this lecture by taking a quick look at three other groups and their reactions to Wilson's grand project. The first of these groups is the military, and here specifically the Navy.
Dirk, if I could interrupt here for a second, before we move on to this next point. What arguments did Wilson give to restrict his notions of democracy to Europe? I mean, why didn't he say, okay, Ireland, Egypt, India? What arguments did he give?
That's a good question. I mean, the problem is if we look at his speeches, he doesn't talk about it. It is as if that problem didn't exist. And he's, of course, once he at the end of the war, he is in Europe to help to make peace. He's of course then, you know, and the sort of dealings with British and French leaders, he's sort of clear about sort of, you know, he's not raising that issue. He's not sort of saying, but what about democracy here? He doesn't really go on record on this issue. So what you have here is kind of universalism. It doesn't address its own limitations. What you have, I mean, is that, I mean, you find this when Wilson talks about the Philippines, which is an American colony. There is this talk that if that were to happen, it could happen at some distant point in the future, after sort of a project of upgrading, of raising people to a certain standard where they could maybe then govern themselves. Mm-hmm. But this kind of language surrounded a European empire already in the 19th century. Whereas this is a rhetoric also that is sort of like ultimately defending empire as a proposition for the present.
So he just really didn't. He just sort of assumed the arguments for empire and really didn't address them in his thinking or his speeches.
Yeah, I mean, this is like if you look at his big speeches in 1917, 1918, it's just not there.
Okay.
So it would have been difficult to be there for obvious reasons. And keep in mind the U.S. is a colonial power as well in 1917, 18. Right? The Philippines are the best example. Mm-hmm. So if I move on, I mean, so maybe so much about Wilson and his critics, right? take a look at the Navy. The Navy is an interesting case. Navy leaders had championed the case for preparedness, pushing for Navy second to none beginning in the summer of 1914, eventually getting there by 1916. Yet on the other, Navy leaders have been very critical of Wilson's policy of neutrality. In fact, Navy leaders had protested against Wilson's toleration of the British blockade. They had explicitly demanded in vain that the U.S. should protect the freedom of the sea against the foreign navies. So what about U.S. Navy leaders then in 1917? Generally speaking, they supported the decision to enter the war, a decision in which they themselves took no direct part. Yet they did not necessarily share Wilson's views. Navy leaders actually thought about world politics and the U.S. place in the world in ways that were very different from Wilson. They thought about world politics dominated just by big powers and their selfish pursuits of national economic interests. So they didn't think about a universal case for democracy. They just thought about big powers fighting over economic interests and empire. In 1415, they made the case for preparedness by arguing that the U.S. needed to ready itself to either take on Germany, perhaps allied with Japan, or take on the British-Japanese combination after the end of the ongoing war. They just assumed the U.S. would have to confront the winner of the war in confrontations over empire. And this could be the British as much as the Germans. And these views had not changed much, as you can see from the excerpt of the document here signed by Admiral Benson, who was sort of the top naval leader, the chief of naval operations in the early 1817. Let's sort of take the last sentence on this slide, right? The possibility of the situations are too appalling to justify us in considering any temporary arrangement not in harmony with the building up of our maximum power as an independent nation. We have therefore to expect and to prepare for one which we shall be unsupported, which may be opposed by great powers in both oceans at once. And then our great general mission to develop the full strength of the U.S. as fast as possible and build up fighting power as an independent nation. So what you kind of see here is something that is very different from the Wilsonian language. Basically, the language of power politics, in which the U.S. would have to engage and would have to engage after the war. And the U.S. needed to make sure that during the war that it would take care of its own interests. And it would be aware that in the future it could run any power, whether it be Britain or Germany. The military men had their own reasons different from Wilson to argue for preparedness and war. Dirk was another group of people who made countercultures with Wilson. So it's like people that we would perhaps not expect to do so. These were intellectuals committed to a world of peace, democracy, and social justice. They were apparently drawn to Wilson in his rhetoric of liberal universalism and his oft-stated belief in the wisdom of experts, rational experts. So one example for this is the famous philosopher John Dewey, one of the key figures of pragmatist philosophy in the U.S., a radical Democrat who in 1917 wrote several pieces in support of preparedness and Wilsonian law. And one of them is sort of on the website, and it's worthwhile reading and using in the classroom, so you can get a sense of how an intellectual is kind of drawn to a case of law that looks appealing on paper. Dewey's piece, in turn, was subjected to a devastating critique by one of his own students, Randall Bourne. This piece, entitled Twilight of Idols, an excerpt you have in front of you. We have here the powerful critique of the intellectual temptations of war, of intellectuals aligning themselves and their agendas with a warfare state that they don't control. And this is a very biting criticism of the kind of naivete that sort of comes with thinking that war can be used to enhance the cause for a certain kind of democratic order. The last group of people I want to talk about today are African Americans and their part in the larger debate over war. African Americans, as we all know, were subjected to white racial rule, especially in the South. Still prominent leaders such as W. Du Bois and African American newspaper editors rallied behind the cause of U.S. intervention in the war, promoted African American military service. What were they thinking, you may want to ask? What could be the promise of war? How did they link it to racial discrimination, violence at home? One answer was provided in Du Bois' famous editorial, Close Ranks, published in 1918. Richard, perhaps you want to read it?
Okay. We of the colored race have no ordinary interest in the outcome. That which the German power represents today spells death to the aspirations of Negroes and all darker races for equality, freedom, and democracy. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens in the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills.
We also, on the next slide, we have two cartoons in African-American newspapers from 1916 and 1917 also giving answers. When you look at them, right, generally speaking, the African-American leaders stressed their loyalty to the nation. They supported the war as a part of a strategy to demand then full rights, full citizenship in response to their participation in war. Right? What we then see in Du Bois' passage in the cartoons here is that African Americans appropriated the language of a war for democracy to make it work for themselves, right? Among other things, pointing out the glaring contradiction between fighting for democracy abroad and not having full democracy at home. So the case for democracy here is applied to the U.S. itself as much as to the world in general, right? The logical extension of the case for democracy was to fight against a racial state at home, to fight for full citizenship and for an end of racial rule, racial supremacy, especially in the South. Lastly, I'm really struck by the cartoon to the right, written in wartime, right? What I find striking about this, and I think this is why I think it works really well in the classroom, is that it's very explicit about the effect of racial rule and racial violence in the present. After all, there were between 50 and 100 lynchings per year in the South between 1890 and 1920, and it's really you can maybe read it, see it better. They're very explicit about the other striking thing about this cartoon is that it kind of toys with the issue of racial fears, right? The soldier here, the African American soldier, says that they should trust him, right? So there's kind of a very interesting way in which this reworks makes racial fears, and one can also read kind of an implicit threat theory. So in a way, if we look at them, and again, we see here the cartoons investing our the imaginations of readers in particular a very powerful way. What we have here is that African Americans were not simply turning a blind eye on their discrimination as they decided to close ranks and help to win the war. But they were very clear about what their key agenda was, and they were keeping it in front of themselves and in front of a wide audience as they were participating in the war. So we're coming now to the end of the presentation. So the question I want to ask, by the way of conclusion, and you may want to think about is whether the U.S. could have avoided entering the war. This is a difficult question. We can debate it endlessly. Here's the beginning of my answer. I would say that if it were not for the German declaration of unconditional submarine warfare in 1917, the U.S. would have not entered the war. It was only this declaration that pushed Wilson and then the nation towards war, and then created an opening to cast the war as the war to make the world safe for democracy. Between 1914 and 1917, the U.S. was increasingly a neutral nation, only named, yet there was no direct line from this kind of partial neutrality to full belligerency. The same is also true for the preparedness campaign. Its key premise was to prepare the United States for a big power confrontation after the end of the war in Europe. And this was not a proposition for an armed intervention in the present. I mean, strikingly, none of the candidates in the presidential elections in 1916 championed the U.S. entry into the war. Could war have been avoided in early 1917 after the Germans had made the decision? The Germans were certain that the decision meant war with the Americans. They were certain that the Wilson administration would not be able to tolerate the expanded German submarine campaign, given its previous policy and its overall pro-British preferences. I agree.
Okay. Well, any of our participants want to join the conversation? Could we have avoided What's your opinion? Do you think we could have avoided entering World War I? Dirk has made an interesting case here. Certainly, there was a good deal of opposition to the war. How much traction did the opposition to the war get based on ethnic divisions, Dirk?
The ethnic divisions are very clear. I mean, the German American community was against the war, and in fact, if you look at the voting pattern in the Senate and in the House, I mean, if you look at the opposition, they mostly came from the Midwest.
Yeah.
And they also came from the far right, and there was some support, sort of, as in Democratic House Majority Leader Nixon from the South. But there was a clear sort of like ethnic, like not an ethnic bias, but it was kind of reflected. The voting pattern reflected some of these communities. Another community were the Irish Americans. The Irish Americans were they were not necessarily pro-German, even though the Germans tried to actually support the cause for for an independent Ireland during the war. They collaborated with some with Irish nationalists. But Irish Americans were also very anti-British. And I think one of the consequences of this is that when Wilson goes to war, that his insistence that the U.S. is only an associated power, the attempt to keep some distance to Britain and France, I think is also a reflection of the sense he had that there was enough resistance or skepticism among broader segments of the American population, skepticism relating to too close a kind of a cooperation and an alliance with the British.
Right. Yeah, and I noticed that Senator LaFollette, who spoke against the Wilson's entry into the war, or Wilson's arguments for the war, he was from Wisconsin, which of course has had a heavy German population then as it does now. Okay. Any other comments? Any other questions? Most of the comments we've gotten about the war here. I generally agree with you, Dirk. I think war could have been avoided, but we were pushed into it with Lusitania. And I think we could have avoided it longer, but I don't know that we could have avoided it forever, one of our participants says. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our presentation here today. Are there any questions that linger out there before we wrap things up this morning? Any final comments or questions? Okay. Well, folks, please use the forum to continue the discussion and to share fresh approaches. We'll monitor the forum until June 1st, and if anything comes across the transom that we need to pass on to Dirk, we will, and he will get back to you, or we will get back to you. Please remember to submit your evaluations. Let me say that this is the last Florida Virtual School Seminar for this year. We've enjoyed working with you over the year. I hope to see you again in the fall. I want to thank all of you for your participation. And Dirk, I want to thank you for giving us an excellent seminar this morning. I learned a great deal. Thank you very much, Dirk.
Well, I thank you. And thank you all for participating.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this time I will wish you a good day, and also I will wish you a good summer, and we hope to be back with you again in the fall. So thank you once again, and please have a great summer. Enjoy yourselves and relax, and we'll see you again back in the fall. Thank you very much. Dirk, I thought that went well. I hope you enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it a great deal. Sorry, I found out at one point that I was rushing through it a little bit toward the end. I think there were probably a few slides too many. But I don't know. What do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think you know, we had a few minutes there at the end. We probably could have explored one or two of the slides in more detail, but I thought it went well. I thought you covered all the points very well. And the part about the African Americans, they probably are pretty well familiar with that because that's come up before in connection with seminars we've done with the Great Migration and the Civil Rights Movement as well. But I thought it was really a good seminar. I know I learned a lot. I didn't realize that Germany was trying to provoke Mexico into war with us. What would have been the provocation? What Mexico just attack us out of the blue? What were they?
I mean, there was a big crisis in 1915, 1916. In fact, Mexican American crisis. In fact, Wilson in 1916 is considering for a while going to war with Mexico. And he actually apparently he wrote he wrote a speech that he then never gave. And there was actually General Pershing, who then commands the American Expeditionary Force in Europe. He was actually the commander of an American force that sort of, and the U.S. had sort of intervened in sort of Mexican politics, and then there was sort of like some border conflict, a border crossing. So there was actually a kind of a tense situation that the Germans thought that they could exploit. And again, they did so with the Zimmermann telegram at a time when they expected the Americans to go to war no matter what. At that point, they were trying to just create at least some trouble.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that, and I also thought that your explanation of why the Germans resorted to U-boat warfare was really interesting. That, you know, until this seminar came up, I had never really thought about that. Why didn't they do the same thing that the British did and try to impose a surface blockade? But your points about the nature of their navy and the geographical situation really argued for U-boats. That hadn't occurred to me. Well, again, thank you so much for doing this. We'll probably be back to ask you to do this again. I know this is a topic that comes up quite often, so we're very likely to be back knocking on your door again. And I hope you enjoyed it enough so that you'd be willing to sign on for another for an encore performance.
I would love it. I mean, I think this was great. As I said at the beginning, I really enjoyed putting this together, and I only hope now that it was as much fun for the teachers than it was for me.
I think it was. I think you gave them a lot of good information and, above all, a lot of good material to take back to their classes, and you contextualize it nicely for them. So, well, I'll let you go. I know you've got your classes are finished. Well, yeah, they are. I mean, Duke graduated last weekend or so.
Yeah, I think my summer officially begins right now because I put in all the grades, and then in the last 10 days I had to give 3 different talks, and today is the last one. And now there's, I think, nothing work-wise on my plate until like August.
Okay, so what do you got? You got some travel involved? You got some research, or what are you going to do?
I'm going to some travel now, and I have a summer. I'm playing a summer vacation. Actually, my wife and I are going to Australia and for a few weeks, and then otherwise it's back to work. And I will spend the next year in Germany doing research. So one of the major things I have to do in the summer is to kind of prepare for it and make sure that I have sort of the most effective research trip. So it's mostly like research on the next big project.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll be here working this summer. We're going to go. My family, we always go for a week to the beach. I'll be doing that in late July, and then my wife and I are going to try to get off for some time in August as well. But I've got. Well, actually, my brothers and I are going to Yellowstone Park in about 2 weeks, and then then we run 2 seminars, or actually 4 seminars. They overlap. 4 seminars in the month of June, and then when that's passed, then I collapse and roll off to the beach for a week of relaxation. So, looking forward to that. So look, thank you very much for doing this. Have a good summer. I have requested your honorarium. Watch for that. If it doesn't come within the next week, let me know. And again, I appreciate you doing this, and I'm giving you fair warning. We'll be back to ask you to do it again.
I hope. I would love it. And thank you so much again, you and Karen. I mean, you really like made this so easy for me. And also, thank you again for being so good about my, you know, the whole postponement.
You're back. Yeah. Well, don't play any soccer. Don't play any soccer this summer. Just do gentle sports like rugby.
I haven't played any soccer yet, and I think I will wait. I will wait.
Okay. Okay. Well, have a good summer, Dirk. Thanks again.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.